Welcome to another deep dive right here on The Explainer. Today, we are looking at something truly fascinating. We're going to explore the concept of navigating total societal collapse, but we aren't using some modern sociological playbook. Instead, we're actually digging into ancient biblical blueprints to see how historical figures responded when their worlds were quite literally falling apart. The parallels to the crises we face today are honestly striking, and I'm so excited to unpack this whole thing with you. Let's get into it. So here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the anatomy of a crisis, look at restoring the SALT covenant, and tackle next-gen spiritual collapse. Then we'll run through the COVID principles, explore an amazing story of despair and prison conversion, and wrap up with a nation's spiritual giant. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Anatomy of a Crisis. To really understand this, we have to look at the era of the prophet Elisha in ancient Israel. Now, according to the historical accounts, the root issue back then was a massive, profound spiritual crisis. The people's hearts were totally divided. They were turning to idolatry, literally worshiping golden calves, openly mocking God's chosen prophets, and just falling into absolute panic the second danger threatened. But here's the wild part. That spiritual decay directly mirrored a devastating social collapse in their day-to-day lives. We are talking about a totally broken generation of youth wandering the streets. We're talking about greedy creditors who were so heartless they literally enslaved the sons of poor widows. And the extreme starvation brought on by war. The siege was so horrific that mothers were driven to the unthinkable just to survive. It was absolute chaos. And this brings us to a really fundamental principle in the source material, specifically from Isaiah 24:5. It says, "The earth suffers for the sins of its people." The biblical text suggests this wasn't just, a string of really bad luck. When people twisted God's instructions and broke his laws, it brought a literal physical curse upon the land itself. This perfectly sets up what was happening to the town of Jericho during Elisha's time. The town was suffering from highly toxic water and a completely barren earth. The land was quite literally reflecting the brokenness of the people living on it. So, how do you fix a crisis like that? That brings us to Section 2. Restoring the SALT covenant. When the leaders of Jericho came to Elisha practically begging for help with their toxic water, Elijah didn't engineer some complex physical water filtration system. No, he used a simple bowl of salt. But why salt? Well, in this context, a covenant of salt represents the enduring, unbreakable nature of God's authority and promises. So by throwing salt into the spring, Elisha was performing this deeply spiritual intervention. According to the narrative, he was showing everyone that true, lasting healing for their land and their society could only happen when they returned to God's authority and restored that solemn agreement. It's this incredibly powerful metaphor, showing that spiritual healing has to come before physical healing. Which leads us to a pretty intense story in Section 3, Next-Gen Spiritual Collapse. Okay, we have to ask a genuinely difficult question here. Why did mocking a prophet lead to such a severe consequence? The story goes that as Elisha was walking along the road to Bethel, this wild group of young boys, essentially a roaming teenage gang, came out and began mercilessly mocking and insulting him. Elisha then cursed them in the name of the Lord, resulting in a terrifying and incredibly severe judgment against these youths. To modern ears, I know, this sounds extreme, like really extreme. So what is actually going on here? The crucial takeaway, according to the text, is this. Actually, scratch the idea that Elisha just lost his temper. This was not his personal wrath. As the narrative shows, this was the living God's judgment on a next-generation spiritual collapse. You see, those youths were a direct reflection of a society that had completely lost its respect for basic human decency and divine authority. Rejecting the messenger literally meant rejecting the living God who sent him. It's a terrifying demonstration of how deeply a broken society's disrespect can run and exactly how severely that total loss of morality is viewed in the text. Okay, moving right along to Section 4, the COVID principles. So how in the world did Elisha navigate this chaotic collapsing era? Well, he didn't just survive it, he actually provided a framework. Now, obviously, we aren't talking about a modern pandemic here. We are using COVID as an ancient mnemonic framework for curing societal collapse. Let's walk through it real quick. C stands for calling. Elisha stepped up to wake the people from their idolatry. O is for overcoming. He actively solved real-life immediate crises, like the bad water and that extreme debt we mentioned, by God's power. V is for vision. He didn't just work alone. He made sure to raise up a whole new generation of disciples. I is for image, which represents the Word of God. He proved the living God existed through undeniable miracles. And finally, D is for the dream of God. He guarded the faithful remnant to preserve that vital covenant we talked about earlier. According to the text, this was his absolute master plan for a society in freefall. Let's completely switch gears now for Section 5, Despair and Prison Conversion. Now, we are going to fast forward and pivot across history. We're jumping to late 19th century Korea to see how these exact same principles applied in modern times, specifically through the life of a really remarkable man named Yi Song-jae. Let's look at how this builds chronologically. Yi Song-jae was born in 1850 and raised as a very strict Neo-Confucian scholar. He firmly, absolutely believed that if Korea was going to be saved from its imminent downfall, it would be purely through political reform and human effort. But prior to 1904, during a massive political crackdown, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. And there, watching his nation crumble and realizing that his Confucian philosophy offered absolutely zero solutions, he fell into a deep, profound spiritual despair. The limits of human wisdom had left him just utterly lost inside a prison cell. But by 1904, he is released. And he isn't a broken political prisoner anymore, he is a reborn Christian. So what happened in that cell? Well, it was a visceral, entirely life-changing conversion. While locked away, Yi began reading the Bible. One night, he fell asleep and, according to his own accounts, actually heard the voice of Jesus telling him, "I am giving you a third opportunity," reminding him of the times he'd previously pushed the gospel away. Later, while reading the Gospel of John, he experienced a vivid vision of Jesus standing right beside him. And in that singular moment, everything just clicked. He realized Jesus wasn't just some great moral teacher, but the living God. And perhaps the absolute hardest step of all, he repented of his intense, burning hatred toward the Japanese and the political traitors who had locked him up. He completely shifted from this prideful political rage to fully submitting to the command to love his enemies. It's an incredible turnaround. And the result of that turnaround? Let's look at Section 6, A Nation's Spiritual Giant. History truly rhymes here, doesn't it? Remember that ancient crisis we discussed earlier? The Bethel Boys? A next-generation spiritual collapse. Wild youth wandering the streets with absolutely no respect. Well, Yi Song-jae saw a very similar crisis in his time. But when he got out of prison, he didn't just go back to playing politics. He enacted the vision principle from our COVID framework. As a massive pillar of the YMCA, he championed youth education. He poured his life into mentoring the next generation, raising up young leaders, and eventually serving as a key figure in the 1919 March 1st independence movement. He saw clearly that to save the nation, you couldn't just change the laws. You had to recover the covenant and save the youth. And his impact? It was truly staggering. Just look at this number, 100,000. When Yi Song-jae passed away in 1927, over 100,000 citizens gathered in the streets. To put that into perspective, it was Korea's first non-official national funeral. They weren't just mourning a political activist, they were honoring a spiritual giant who had dedicated his life to national salvation through spiritual revival. In every sense of the word, he had become the salt that healed his nation's waters. And that brings us to the final, provocative thought of this explainer. The ancient story of Elisha in Jericho and the incredible modern transformation of Yi Song-jae in Korea leave us with one very clear question. When faced with a crisis, how will you react? Will you rely solely on your own human effort, your own political reforms, and risk falling into that same despair? Or will you step into your calling, restore your foundation, and become the salt that brings true healing to the world around you? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked these incredible historical sources today on The Explainer. Never stop learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.